"Don't you dare leave me, Ayanna." Those words echoed through the empty restaurant as Conrad Hale dropped to his knees beside the motionless figure on the wooden bench. The young black woman, who cleaned his floors every night for 3 years, was barely breathing. Her cleaning cart sat abandoned nearby, bottles of disinfectant scattered across the tile, like evidence of a struggle. But this wasn't supposed to happen. Not in his restaurant. Not to her. Conrad's hands shook as he pressed 2 fingers against Ayanna's neck, searching desperately for a pulse. The silence stretched like torture. Nothing. His heart hammered against his ribs as panic flooded his system. This woman who always greeted him with a tired but genuine smile, who worked harder than anyone he'd ever met, who somehow made his coldest business decisions feel warmer just by being there. She was dying right in front of him. Come on," he whispered, repositioning his fingers. The restaurant felt impossibly quiet. Outside, the city hummed with late-night energy, but in here, time had stopped. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows across Ayanna's face, making her look even more fragile. Then, like a miracle he didn't deserve, he felt it. Faint. Irregular. But there. A pulse. Conrad exhaled so hard his vision blurred. Relief crashed over him in waves, but it was short-lived. Her breathing was shallow, labored. Something was terribly wrong. He fumbled for his phone, fingers clumsy with adrenaline, ready to call 911. That's when he saw it. A crumpled envelope, wedged under her right hand like she'd been clutching it when she collapsed. His name was scrawled across the front in handwriting he didn't recognize. Bold, urgent letters that seemed to pulse with their own energy. Conrad Hale. For a split second, he hesitated. Ayanna needed medical attention immediately. But something about that envelope made his skin crawl. The way it was hidden. The way her fingers seemed to be protecting it even in unconsciousness. What had she discovered that was so important she'd risk everything to tell him? His business instincts kicked in, the same instincts that had built his empire from nothing. Information was power, and right now, he needed all the power he could get. Conrad carefully pried the envelope from her grip, his eyes never leaving her face. Her breathing hitched, and for one terrifying moment, he thought he'd lost her again. But then it steadied, weak but consistent. The envelope felt heavier than it should. Whatever was inside wasn't just a note. There was something else, something that crinkled when he touched it. "What were you trying to tell me?" he whispered to her unconscious form. Ayanna had always been different from his other employees. She noticed things others missed, asked questions that made him uncomfortable, stayed late not because she had to, but because she seemed genuinely invested in keeping his restaurant perfect. He'd assumed it was just work ethic. Now, he wondered if it was something else entirely. The city lights from the street painted shifting patterns on the restaurant walls. Conrad's empire consisted of 37 restaurants across 12 states. Each one was a masterpiece of efficiency and profit. But this first location where he'd started with nothing but determination and a borrowed kitchen, this one was different. This one had secrets, and Ayanna had found them. Her eyelids fluttered, just barely. Conrad leaned closer, hope building in his chest. Her lips moved soundlessly, like she was trying to speak. He strained to hear anything, any clue about what had happened to her. "Ayanna, can you hear me?" His voice was gentler than he'd used in years. "You're safe now. I'm here." But even as he said it, he wondered if it was true. Safe from what? From who? The envelope in his hands felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Whatever was inside had nearly cost this woman her life. Conrad had built his fortune by making calculated risks. Every decision was measured against potential profit or loss. But as he knelt on that cold restaurant floor, holding evidence of something he didn't yet understand, he realized this wasn't about business anymore. This was about survival. His or hers, he wasn't sure which. The overhead lights flickered once, casting the restaurant in momentary darkness. In that brief second, Conrad could have sworn he saw movement near the kitchen entrance. A shadow that didn't belong. When the lights steadied, nothing was there. But the feeling remained. They were being watched. Conrad's grip tightened on the envelope. Whatever Ayanna had discovered, whatever had put her in danger, was now his burden to carry. The question was whether he was strong enough to handle the truth, or whether the truth would destroy them both. He looked down at her peaceful face one more time before making his decision. Some envelopes were meant to be opened. Some secrets demanded to be revealed, even if they changed everything. Conrad's hands trembled as he tore open the envelope. Inside, along with a folded piece of paper, were 3 photographs that made his blood turn to ice. The first showed his restaurants back in trance at night. Nothing unusual there. The second captured someone in a dark hoodie slipping through that same door. Still nothing that couldn't be explained. But the third photograph destroyed any hope of a simple explanation. It showed stacks of cash being passed between 2 figures in his own kitchen. One wore the distinctive uniform of his management staff. The other's face was obscured, but the expensive watch on their wrist caught the light perfectly. Conrad recognized that watch. He'd seen it dozens of times in board meetings. His hands shook harder as he unfolded the note. Ayanna's handwriting was neat, precise, urgent. Conrad, they're using your restaurant to launder money. I've been watching for weeks. Every Tuesday night after closing, they meet in the kitchen. Manager Rodriguez is involved, but he's not in charge. The person giving orders. I think you know them. I tried to get more evidence tonight, but they saw me. I heard them talking about cleaning up loose ends. They mentioned your name. And mine. I don't know who else to trust. Everyone else either doesn't care or is already involved. Be careful. They're coming for me. And if you try to help, they'll come for you too. Ayanna. P.S. Check the security footage from camera 7. Back kitchen storage room. But be careful who you trust with it. Conrad read the note twice, his mind racing. Rodriguez had been with him for 5 years. Reliable, efficient, never caused problems. The idea that he was stealing from him, using his own business as a front, felt like a physical blow. But worse was the implication about someone Conrad knew personally. Someone close enough to wear expensive jewelry to secret meetings. Someone who had access to his restaurants and his trust. A soft sound made him look down. Ayanna's eyes were open, unfocused but aware. Her lips moved soundlessly at first, then formed words so quiet he had to lean close to hear them. "They'll come for me," she whispered. Her voice was raw, frightened. "Saw me, taking pictures." "Who? Who's coming for you?" Conrad's voice was urgent but gentle. "Ayanna, who did this to you?" Her eyes found his, and for a moment they were crystal clear, filled with a terror that made his stomach drop. "You're your partner." Before he could ask what she meant, her eyes rolled back and her body went limp again. Conrad's world tilted. Partner? He didn't have partners in the traditional sense. His restaurants were his empire, built by him alone. But there were investors, board members, people who'd helped fund his expansion. A chill ran down his spine as possibilities flooded his mind. How many people had access to his security systems? How many knew his schedules, his routines? How many could walk into any of his restaurants without question? The answer was terrifying, too many. He looked at the photographs again, studying every detail. The expensive watch, the posture of the figure, the way they held themselves with casual authority. Someone he trusted was trying to destroy everything he'd built. And they were willing to hurt, maybe kill, an innocent woman to keep their secret safe. Conrad's jaw tightened as he made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't just going to save Ayanna's life. He was going to find out who was betraying him, even if it meant discovering that the person he trusted most was his greatest enemy. The hunt was about to begin. Conrad stared at Ayanna's unconscious face and realized he knew almost nothing about her. 3 years. She'd cleaned his restaurant for 3 years, and all he knew was her first name and that she worked harder than anyone else. She was invisible to him, just another employee badge number in his vast empire. The kind of person he'd built his fortune on, but never bothered to truly see. Now, as he sat beside her in the dim restaurant light, that invisibility felt like a crushing weight on his chest. Her employee file was probably buried in some HR database, reduced to social security numbers and tax forms. But the woman lying here had risked everything to warn him about a conspiracy in his own business. She'd put her life on the line for someone who barely acknowledged her existence. What kind of person does that? Conrad studied her face, really looked at her for the first time. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe 25. There were calluses on her hands from years of hard work. Her cleaning uniform was faded but spotless. She took pride in her appearance, even in a job most people looked down on. A small scar above her left eyebrow caught his attention. It looked old, maybe from childhood. He found himself wondering about the story behind it. Had she fallen off a bike? Been in an accident? Did she have family who worried about that scar the way he now worried about her shallow breathing? The questions multiplied in his mind. Where did she live? Did she have children? Dreams beyond mopping floors and emptying trash cans? Why had she chosen to work nights at the Sapphire Room instead of somewhere closer to home? The Sapphire Room, his flagship restaurant, the crown jewel of his empire. Built on the site of an old community center in a neighborhood that had seen better days. He'd bought the land cheap, demolished what was there, and created something profitable. But what had been there before? Who had lost something when he'd built his dream? Conrad's phone buzzed with notifications, missed calls from investors, texts about tomorrow's board meetings, emails about quarterly projections. His normal world demanding his attention. The world where people like Ayanna didn't matter unless they affected the bottom line. He silenced the phone. For the first time in years, profit margins felt less important than the person in front of him. Ayanna shifted slightly, her breathing becoming more regular. Color was slowly returning to her cheeks. Whatever had happened to her, drugs, exhaustion, fear, she was fighting back. That told him something crucial about her character. She was a fighter. The photographs and note lay scattered on the bench beside him. Evidence of corruption in his own business. But more than that, evidence that someone he barely noticed had been protecting him while he wasn't even paying attention. How many other people in his empire were invisible to him? How many worked multiple jobs just to survive while he counted his billions? How many had stories, dreams, struggles that would matter if he bothered to ask? The thought made him uncomfortable. He'd always justified his success by telling himself he'd earned it through hard work. But hard work compared to what? Compared to Ayanna scrubbing floors at midnight to pay rent? Compared to single mothers working 3 jobs just to feed their kids? Maybe his definition of hard work needed adjustment. A soft knock at the front door made him freeze. The restaurant had been closed for hours. Nobody should be here except him and Ayanna. He looked toward the glass entrance and saw a figure silhouetted against the street lights. Someone was watching them. Conrad's protective instincts kicked in, instincts he didn't even know he had. This woman had tried to save his business. Now it was his turn to save her. The partnership he never knew he needed was about to begin. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Conrad moved quietly to the window, staying low to avoid being seen. The figure outside wore a maintenance uniform and carried a clipboard. Someone who would blend in perfectly in a business district. Professional. Planned. Too planned for comfort. He waited, barely breathing, until the person finally walked away. But the message was clear. They were being watched. Whoever was behind this knew he'd found Ayanna. Knew he was getting involved. Which meant they also knew he was now a threat. Conrad pulled out his phone and opened the app that controlled his restaurant's security system. If Ayana was right about camera 7, he needed to see that footage before anyone else did. But as he scrolled through the system, something made his blood run cold. The back kitchen camera, camera 7, showed maintenance mode for the past 6 weeks. Every Tuesday night, right around the time Ayana said the meetings happened, the camera mysteriously went offline for exactly 3 hours. That wasn't random. That was someone with administrative access to his security system. Conrad's mind raced through the list of people with that level of access. His IT manager, Rodriguez, the regional security coordinator, and 3 board members. 5 people he trusted completely. One of them was betraying him. He switched to the financial dashboard on his phone, something he checked obsessively every morning. But now, he wasn't looking at profits. He was looking for patterns, inconsistencies, things that had always been there, but never seemed important. Tuesday night deposits at the Sapphire Room had been consistently higher than other locations for the past 8 months. Not dramatically higher, just enough to look like good business. But when he compared them to actual sales reports, the numbers didn't match. Someone was depositing extra money every Tuesday night and disguising it as restaurant income. The perfect money laundering scheme, hidden in plain sight within his legitimate business. Conrad felt sick. His empire, everything he'd built, was being used by criminals. Worse, someone close to him was not just allowing it to happen, they were orchestrating it. He started digging deeper into the financial records, his fingers flying across the phone screen. Payroll discrepancies, vendor payments to companies he'd never heard of. Small amounts spread across multiple accounts, designed to look normal. But they weren't normal. They were systematic, professional. His phone buzzed with an incoming call. Rodriguez. Conrad stared at the name on the screen, his heart pounding. Rodriguez calling at 2:47 a.m. wasn't suspicious by itself. Managers often handled late-night emergencies. But after everything he'd just discovered, the timing felt like more than coincidence. He declined the call. Immediately, another call came through. This time from his IT manager, Carlos Rivera. Then another from his regional security coordinator. 3 calls in 2 minutes. From 3 people with access to his security system. That wasn't coincidence. That was coordination. Conrad's hands shook as he powered down his phone. They knew he was here. They knew what he'd found. And they were closing in. He looked back at Ayana, still unconscious on the bench. She'd risked everything to expose this conspiracy. Now they were both in danger because of secrets that had been hiding in plain sight all along. The beautiful thing about his empire had always been its transparency. Every transaction recorded, every employee monitored, every decision documented. He'd built the perfect system for accountability. He'd also built the perfect system for sophisticated criminals to hide their tracks. The irony would have been amusing if his life wasn't at stake. Conrad made a decision that went against every business instinct he developed over 20 years. Instead of gathering more evidence, instead of building a bulletproof case, he was going to trust someone. He was going to trust the janitor who tried to save him, even if it meant risking everything he'd worked for. Conrad's hands moved gently as he searched Ayana's cleaning cart for any personal items. He needed to know more about her, needed to understand why she'd risk her life for his business. In the bottom compartment, beneath bottles of floor cleaner and industrial disinfectant, he found a small canvas bag. Inside were a few personal belongings, a worn leather wallet, house keys, and a faded photograph that made him stop breathing. The photo showed a young girl, clearly Ayana, maybe 8 years old, standing beside a tall, smiling black man in a construction helmet. Behind them was a building under renovation, scaffolding and equipment visible in the background. Conrad recognized that building. It was the old community center that had been demolished to build the Sapphire Room. His restaurant was built on the exact spot where this photograph was taken. With trembling fingers, he flipped the photo over. In careful handwriting, someone had written, Ayanna and Daddy at his last job. Elijah Brooks, Project Supervisor. The Sapphire Room Construction, 2019. The world tilted around Conrad. Ayanna's father had worked on his restaurant, had helped build the foundation of his empire, and according to the date, had disappeared right before the project was completed. Conrad's memory flashed back to 6 years ago. The construction had hit several delays, problems with city permits, issues with contractors. His project manager had mentioned that one of the supervisors had left unexpectedly near the end, causing scheduling problems. He'd been annoyed about the delays, never thought about the human cost. Now he was staring at evidence that the supervisor who'd vanished wasn't just another contractor changing jobs. He was Ayanna's father, a man who'd never come home to his daughter. A soft moan from the bench made him look up. Ayanna's eyes were open again, clearer this time. She was looking directly at the photograph in his hands. "You found it," she whispered. Her voice was stronger now, though still fragile. "I always carry that with me." Ayanna. Conrad's voice was thick with emotion he didn't know how to process. "Your father worked on my restaurant." She nodded slowly, pushing herself up to a sitting position with obvious effort. Elijah Brooks. Everyone called him Eli. He was so excited about that job. Said he was finally working on something that would make the neighborhood better. Conrad felt like he was drowning. The construction records said he left for another job. "That's what they told me too." Her eyes hardened with old pain. "But Daddy wouldn't have left without saying goodbye. He wouldn't have missed my high school graduation. He wouldn't have abandoned me when Mom was sick." The pieces were falling into place in Conrad's mind, forming a picture that made him feel sick with guilt and responsibility. "You think something happened to him during construction?" "I know something happened." Ayanna's voice grew stronger with conviction. "The last time I saw him, he was worried about something at the job site. Said there were things happening that weren't right. Money being moved around, contracts that didn't make sense. He was going to report it to the authorities." Conrad's hands clenched into fists. "And then he disappeared." 3 days later, his car was found abandoned near the river. Police said he probably jumped. Case closed. Her voice cracked with old grief. But Daddy wasn't the type to give up, ever. "That's why you took the job here," Conrad realized. "You've been investigating. For 6 years." Tears ran down her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "I needed to know what happened to him. I needed to find proof that he didn't just abandon us." Conrad looked at the photograph again, at the proud smile on Elijah Brooks' face. A man who'd helped build his empire and then vanished without a trace. A man whose daughter had been cleaning his floors for 3 years, searching for answers. The weight of that truth was almost unbearable. Conrad's phone buzzed once, a sharp sound that cut through the heavy silence. He glanced at the screen and felt ice form in his veins. Unknown number. Text message. "Stop digging, or you'll end up like her father." The words seemed to burn themselves into his retinas. Whoever sent this wasn't just aware of their conversation. They'd been listening, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to make their presence known. Conrad showed the message to Ayanna. Her face went pale, but her jaw set with determination rather than fear. "They killed him," she said quietly. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a statement of fact that had been 6 years in the making. "We don't know that for certain," Conrad started, but another text cut him off. "The Brooks family has suffered enough. Don't make us add another name to the list." This time, there was an attachment. A photograph taken from outside the restaurant, showing Conrad kneeling beside Ayanna just moments earlier. The angle suggested it had been taken from across the street with a long-range lens. They were being watched right now. "We need to get out of here," Conrad said, his voice tight with panic. But as he helped Ayanna to her feet, a third message arrived. "Running won't help. We know where she lives. We know where you live. We know everything. Ayana swayed slightly, still weak, but her eyes were blazing with fury. 6 years, she whispered. 6 years, I've wondered if I was crazy for thinking someone killed my father. Now I know I wasn't. Conrad felt something shift inside him. His entire life had been about building, creating, growing his empire. But now, for the first time, he was facing something that needed to be torn down. Something that had poisoned everything he'd worked for. They're using your restaurant to launder money, Ayana continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. But that's not all they're doing. They're using it to hide bodies too. The words hit Conrad like a physical blow. What do you mean? The foundation, she said simply. The Sapphire Room was built on the old community center, but the excavation went much deeper than the original plans called for. I've been checking the city records. They dug down an extra 12 feet and poured concrete over something. Conrad's mind raced back to the construction delays, the permit problems, the unexpected costs that had nearly bankrupted him in those early days. He'd been so focused on opening the restaurant that he'd never questioned why the foundation work had taken so long. You think your father is? I think my father found out what they were burying under your restaurant, Ayana said. And they killed him for it. Another text arrived, this one with a new photo. It showed the front entrance of a small apartment building. Conrad didn't recognize it, but Ayana's sharp intake of breath told him everything he needed to know. Last warning. Walk away now or join Daddy in the foundation. The threat wasn't subtle anymore. It was direct, immediate, and terrifyingly specific. Conrad looked at Ayana, this brave woman who'd spent 6 years searching for the truth about her father's disappearance, who'd risked her life to warn him about corruption in his own business, who was now being threatened because she tried to do the right thing. His empire was built on a grave. His success was founded on someone else's murder. And now the same people who'd killed Elijah Brooks were coming for his daughter. Everything Conrad thought he knew about his business, his success, his life, was a lie. But for the first time in years, he knew exactly what he had to do. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to hide. He was going to fight back, even if it cost him everything he'd built. Conrad made a decision that went against every survival instinct screaming in his head. Instead of running from the threats, instead of calling the police, who might be compromised, he was going to find the truth himself. Right here, right now. The foundation, he said to Ayana. You said they dug deeper than the original plans. Where exactly? She pointed toward the back of the restaurant, near the kitchen, the storage area. It was supposed to be a simple concrete slab, but the construction records show they went down 12 feet and used 3 times more concrete than necessary. Conrad had walked past that storage room thousands of times. It looked completely normal, just another utility space filled with restaurant supplies. But now, knowing what might be hidden beneath it, the room felt different. Dangerous. There has to be access, he muttered, his mind racing. They couldn't have just buried everything. They'd need a way to add more evidence, if necessary. The thought made his stomach turn, but he forced himself to think like the criminals who'd stolen his business. They were smart, organized, patient. They wouldn't create a problem they couldn't solve later. Conrad grabbed a flashlight from behind the bar and headed toward the storage room, Ayana close behind him despite her obvious weakness. The room was exactly as he remembered it, metal shelving units filled with paper towels, cleaning supplies, and restaurant equipment. But now he was looking for things that didn't belong. Inconsistencies. Signs of recent construction or modification. There, Ayana pointed to the far corner, where a newer section of flooring met the original concrete. That part looks different. She was right. The concrete in that corner was slightly different in color and texture, as if it had been poured at a different time than the rest of the floor. Conrad knelt down and ran his hands along the seam. His fingers found what felt like a hidden handle, flush with the floor and nearly invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. "Help me," he said, and together they pulled upward, A section of the floor lifted away, revealing a set of metal stairs leading down into darkness. The smell that rose from below was stale and musty, like air that had been trapped for years. Conrad's flashlight beam cut through the blackness, illuminating a space that shouldn't exist. A hidden basement roughly 10 feet by 12 feet, with concrete walls and a dirt floor. And in that dirt floor were things that made his blood freeze. Pieces of construction equipment that looked like they'd been abandoned mid-project. Work boots covered in old mud. A hard hat with E. Brooks written in fading marker across the front. Ayanna made a sound that was part sob, part gasp. She climbed down the stairs on shaking legs, Conrad right behind her. "Daddy's helmet," she whispered, picking up the hard hat with trembling hands. He never went anywhere without this. But that wasn't the most disturbing discovery. In the far corner of the hidden room, partially buried under loose dirt, were stacks of documents wrapped in plastic. Financial records, construction contracts, and photographs that told a story Conrad didn't want to believe. The photographs showed money changing hands between people in expensive suits and construction workers. They showed trucks dumping something that definitely wasn't construction materials into the excavation site. They showed meetings in this very basement, back when it was just a dirt hole in the ground. And in several photos, Conrad recognized faces. His own COO, Victor Lang, shaking hands with men Conrad had never seen before. Rodriguez, his trusted manager, accepting an envelope thick with cash. But the most shocking photograph showed something that made Conrad's knees weak. Elijah Brooks, clearly alive, clearly terrified, with his hands bound behind his back. Standing right here in this basement. The timestamp on the photo showed it was taken 3 days after he'd supposedly left the job. They didn't just kill him, Conrad realized with horror. They kept him here first. Ayanna was crying now, clutching her father's hard hat to her chest. But through her tears, her voice was steady with rage. He tried to expose them. He found out they were using the construction project to hide their crimes, and they murdered him for it. Conrad's phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. "You shouldn't have gone downstairs. Now you know too much." The message was followed by a live video feed. Security camera footage showing Conrad and Ayanna in the hidden basement, recorded in real time. They weren't just being watched from outside the restaurant. The criminals had cameras installed down here too, which meant they knew exactly what Conrad had discovered. And they were probably already on their way. If this revelation shocked you, subscribe now to see what Conrad uncovers next. The basement door slammed shut above them with a sound like thunder. Conrad looked up in panic, then at his phone. No signal. The concrete walls were blocking everything, cutting them off from the outside world completely. They were trapped. Footsteps echoed from the restaurant above. Multiple people moving with purpose. Conrad heard voices, muffled but urgent. Someone was giving orders. "The emergency exit," Ayanna whispered, pointing to what looked like a ventilation grate near the ceiling. "Daddy always said construction sites needed multiple escape routes." Before Conrad could respond, they heard the metallic sound of the basement door being unlocked from above. Someone was coming down. The first person to descend the metal stairs was someone Conrad trusted completely. Victor Lang, his chief operating officer for 8 years. The man who'd helped him expand from one restaurant to an empire. The man who'd been at Conrad's wedding, who'd celebrated every business milestone, who Conrad considered more than an employee. He considered him a friend. "You really shouldn't have come down here," Victor said, his voice carrying a sadness that felt genuine. "I tried to warn you off with the texts. I hoped you'd be smart enough to walk away." Conrad felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "Victor, you're behind all this." "Not behind it, just managing it." Victor stepped carefully around the evidence scattered on the dirt floor. "This operation was here long before your restaurant. We just adapted when you bought the property. The money laundering, the missing people. You killed Elijah Brooks. Victor's expression hardened. Elijah Brooks was supposed to finish the foundation and forget what he'd seen. Instead, he started asking questions, taking pictures, threatening to call the FBI. So you murdered him. We solved a problem. Victor's tone was matter-of-fact, businesslike. The same tone he used in board meetings. Just like we're going to solve the problem you've created tonight. 2 more men appeared at the top of the stairs, both wearing dark clothing and carrying equipment that looked decidedly non-corporate. Conrad recognized them from the security footage. The same figures who'd been using his restaurant for their criminal meetings. 8 years, Conrad said, his voice thick with betrayal. 8 years I trusted you. I made you rich. I treated you like family. And I appreciate that. I really do. Victor sounded almost sincere. But this business was worth $50 million a year before you built your little restaurant on top of it. We weren't going to let some idealistic entrepreneur ruin decades of careful planning. Ayanna stepped forward, her father's hard hat still clutched in her hands. You killed my father because he wouldn't let you turn his construction project into a graveyard. Your father was collateral damage, nothing personal. Victor's dismissive tone made Ayanna's eyes blaze with fury. Though I have to admit, hiring his daughter as our cleaning lady was a stroke of genius. Who better to keep an eye on than someone who might come looking for answers? The realization hit Conrad like a physical blow. You recommended her for the job. You told me she was the best candidate. I told you she was motivated. And she was. Motivated to find her father. Victor smiled coldly. I just never expected her to actually succeed. One of the men at the top of the stairs called down. Victor, we need to move. Police scanner shows increased activity in this area. Which brings us to the end of our conversation, Victor said, pulling something from his jacket. I want you both to know this isn't personal. You forced our hand. But as Victor raised the weapon, Conrad saw something in the shadows that gave him the first hope he'd felt all night. The emergency grate Ayanna had pointed out wasn't just loose. It was open, and someone was watching from the other side. The fluorescent lights were too bright, making everything look washed out and sterile. Ayanna blinked slowly, trying to focus on the ceiling tiles above her. Hospital. She was in a hospital bed, with an 4 in her arm and monitors beeping softly nearby. But she was alive. The last thing she remembered clearly was being trapped in the basement with Conrad, Victor pointing a gun at them. And then chaos. Shouting, sirens, people in uniform swarming through the hidden room. You're awake. The voice came from a chair beside her bed. Conrad, looking exhausted but unharmed. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by suspicion. How did she know he wasn't part of it too? Where are we? Her throat felt raw, like she'd been screaming. Metro General. You've been unconscious for 14 hours. Conrad leaned forward, genuine concern in his eyes. The doctors said you had a severe reaction to whatever drug they gave you. Something to keep you quiet while they decided what to do with us. Ayanna studied his face, looking for any sign of deception. She'd learned not to trust easily, especially not rich men who claimed to care about people like her. Victor. In custody, along with Rodriguez and 3 others. Conrad's voice was tight with anger. The FBI had been watching the money laundering operation for months, but they needed evidence. What we found in that basement gave them everything they needed. The FBI. Ayanna pushed herself up in the bed, ignoring the dizziness. How did they know to come? Conrad looked uncomfortable. I called them. Before we went into the basement. I figured if something happened to us, at least someone would know where to look. That surprised her. Most business owners would have tried to handle things quietly, to avoid the scandal and negative publicity. You risked your entire empire to expose them. My entire empire was built on lies. Conrad's voice was quiet but firm. Your father died trying to stop them from using my restaurant as a front for murder. The least I could do was finish what he started. Ayanna felt some of her suspicion fade. This man had every reason to cover up the scandal, to pay people off, to make the problem disappear quietly. Instead, he'd chosen to do the right thing, even though it might cost him everything. What happens now, she asked. Now you recover. The doctors want to keep you for observation another day or two. Conrad hesitated, then continued. I also want to offer you something. A job. Not cleaning floors. Ayanna raised an eyebrow. What kind of job? The FBI investigation is going to take months. They'll need someone who understands the restaurant operations, someone who knows what to look for. Conrad met her eyes directly. Someone who cares about finding the truth more than protecting profits. You want me to help you clean up your own business? I want you to help me rebuild it the right way. With transparency. With accountability. With people who won't disappear in the middle of the night. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, processing everything. Her father had died trying to expose corruption in Conrad's empire. Now Conrad was asking her to help him fix what her father had died trying to reveal. There's one condition, she said finally. Name it. I want a memorial for my father. In the restaurant. Something that tells people he was a good man who stood up for what was right. Conrad's eyes brightened. Actually, I was thinking we could do better than that. What if we turned the restaurant into a community center? Something that serves the neighborhood instead of just taking from it. For the first time in 6 years, Ayanna smiled through her tears. Her father would have liked that. 3 weeks later, Conrad sat in his lawyer's office, staring at documents that would change everything. The papers spread across the mahogany table represented two very different futures. On the left, a settlement agreement that would make the whole scandal disappear. The FBI was willing to take the criminals they'd caught and let Conrad's empire continue operating with minimal changes. His lawyers assured him it was the smart choice. Business as usual within 6 months. On the right, a different set of documents. Plans to convert the Sapphire Room into the Elijah Brooks Community Center. Financial projections showing how much money he'd lose. Legal frameworks for transparency that would make his business less profitable but more honest. You need to understand what you're giving up, his head lawyer said for the 3rd time. The settlement protects your reputation, your assets, your future expansion plans. The alternative. He gestured at the community center plans. This is business suicide. Conrad picked up the photo Ayanna had given him, the one of her and her father at the construction site. Elijah Brooks had died because he'd refused to look the other way when he saw something wrong. He'd chosen principles over profit, truth over convenience. Now Conrad faced the same choice. Have you calculated the cost of the settlement? He asked his lawyer. 0 direct cost. The government covers legal fees. You pay a small fine. Business continues. No, I mean the real cost. Conrad set down the photo. The cost of knowing that people died to build my success. The cost of looking at myself in the mirror every day. The cost of teaching my children that money matters more than human lives. His lawyer looked uncomfortable. Conrad, you're not responsible for what Victor and his people did. You were a victim too. Was I? Conrad stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city he'd helped shape with his restaurants. I built my empire by not asking questions, by not caring about the people who work for me, by focusing on profits instead of principles. He thought about Ayanna, who'd spent 6 years searching for answers about her father while cleaning floors that Conrad barely noticed, who'd risked her life to warn him about corruption in his own business, who'd shown more courage in one night than he'd shown in 20 years of building his empire. The community center is the right choice, he said finally. It's financial suicide. Your board will never approve it. Conrad smiled for the first time in weeks. Then I'll fire the board. It's my company. Conrad, please think about this rationally. I am thinking rationally. He turned back to face his lawyer. Rationally, I realize that an empire built on lies isn't worth protecting. Rationally, I understand that real success means creating something that makes the world better, not just making me richer. Conrad picked up the community center plans and signed his name at the bottom of each page. With each signature, he felt lighter, like he was shedding weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. What about your other restaurants? His lawyer asked weakly. We'll audit every single one. Any location with questionable activities gets the same treatment. Transparency, accountability, community benefit. Conrad gathered up the signed documents. And if that means I end up with fewer restaurants but more integrity, I can live with that. As he walked out of the lawyer's office, Conrad's phone buzzed with a text from Ayanna. Groundbreaking ceremony is next month. Daddy would be proud. Conrad smiled, knowing she was right. Elijah Brooks had died for his principles. The least Conrad could do was live for his. For the first time in his career, he was building something that would last longer than profit margins. He was building something worth inheriting. The FBI had arrested Victor and his crew, but Conrad knew the investigation was far from over. Sitting in his corporate office at 3 a.m., surrounded by boxes of financial records, he realized the corruption ran deeper than anyone had imagined. What started as a simple money laundering operation had tentacles reaching into every corner of his business empire. Ayanna sat across from him, her laptop open to construction databases and city permit records. She'd been discharged from the hospital 2 days ago, but instead of resting, she'd thrown herself into the investigation with an intensity that both impressed and worried Conrad. Look at this, she said, pointing to her screen. The same construction company that built the Sapphire Room also worked on 5 of your other locations. Always the same pattern. Excavation deeper than necessary, concrete overages, mysterious delays. Conrad felt sick. 5 more restaurants built on graves. Maybe more. Ayanna pulled up another document. I cross-referenced the missing persons reports from each city where you have locations. The numbers are... She paused, clearly struggling with what she discovered. How many? 17 people vanished during construction phases across your restaurants. All of them were construction workers, city inspectors, or community activists who opposed the projects. The weight of that number hit Conrad like a physical blow. 17 families torn apart. 17 people silenced because they'd stood in the way of his empire. His phone buzzed with a text from FBI agent Torres, who'd been coordinating the investigation. We need those financial records ASAP. Someone's been trying to access your company servers remotely. Conrad showed the message to Ayanna. They're not done. Even with Victor in custody, someone else is trying to cover their tracks. Or destroy evidence, Ayanna said grimly. We need to move faster. They worked through the night, copying documents, photographing evidence, uploading everything to secure FBI servers. The pattern became clearer with each file they examined. Someone had been using Conrad's restaurant empire as a front for a much larger criminal organization. The construction company that built his restaurants was owned by a shell corporation. That corporation was funded by offshore accounts connected to organized crime families. Money flowed in a carefully constructed circle. Dirty cash became restaurant investments. Restaurant profits were reinvested in more construction projects. And the cycle continued. But the most disturbing discovery came at dawn, when Ayanna found a list hidden in Victor's encrypted files. Conrad, she said quietly, her voice tight with fear. You need to see this. The document was titled Loose Ends, Priority Elimination. It contained names, addresses, and photos of people connected to the various construction projects. Some names were crossed out in red ink, with dates beside them. Conrad recognized some of the dates. They corresponded with missing persons reports from different cities. But what made his blood freeze was seeing names that weren't crossed out yet. People who were still alive, still potentially dangerous to the organization. Ayana's name was on the list. So was his. We're not safe, Conrad realized. Even with Victor arrested, whoever's running this operation knows we're gathering evidence. As if summoned by his words, the building's fire alarm began blaring. But Conrad hadn't smelled smoke. He looked out his office window and saw 3 black SUVs parked across the street, engines running. That's not a fire alarm, Ayana said, grabbing the laptop. That's a distraction. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside Conrad's office. Multiple people moving with military precision. Conrad grabbed a USB drive containing copies of all their evidence and handed it to Ayana. The service elevator, he whispered. Get to the parking garage. If something happens to me, take this directly to Agent Torres. I'm not leaving you. You're not dying for me either. Conrad's voice was firm. Your father died trying to expose these people. I won't let them kill his daughter too. The footsteps stopped outside his office door. Someone was picking the lock. The office door exploded inward with a crash that shook the entire floor. 3 men in tactical gear burst through, weapons drawn, moving like they'd done this many times before. But Conrad and Ayana were already gone, disappeared through the hidden service door that connected his office to the building's maintenance corridors. Basement, Conrad whispered as they ran down the narrow service stairs. My car's in the executive parking section. Behind them, they could hear the men tearing apart the office, shouting orders in clipped, professional voices. These weren't street criminals. These were specialists. The parking garage was eerily quiet, their footsteps echoing off concrete walls. Conrad's car was parked in its usual spot, but something felt wrong. Too quiet. Too empty. Wait, Ayana grabbed his arm as he reached for the car door. Look at the tires. All 4 tires had been slashed. But more than that, the hood was slightly open, as if someone had been working under it. They knew we'd come here, Conrad realized. This was planned. The sound of the stairwell door slamming open echoed through the garage. Their pursuers had found the service corridor. Conrad spotted an emergency exit sign on the far side of the garage. There. Fire stairs to the street level. They ran, staying low behind parked cars. Conrad's expensive business shoes weren't made for running, but adrenaline kept him moving. Ayana, despite everything she'd been through, moved like an athlete, quiet and fast. The exit door was chained shut. No, Conrad pulled at the chains desperately. This is supposed to be an emergency exit. They planned this, Ayana said, her voice surprisingly calm. They knew every way out. Footsteps were getting closer. Flashlight beams swept across the garage, hunting for them. Then Ayana did something unexpected. She pulled out her phone and started recording a video message. What are you doing? Insurance, she whispered, holding the phone close to her face. My name is Ayana Brooks. If something happens to me tonight, the evidence we gathered is on a USB drive hidden in... She quickly described a location in the building. Conrad Hale tried to do the right thing. Don't let them silence us. She hit send, uploading the video to her social media accounts. Brilliant, Conrad breathed. They can't kill us without the whole world knowing. But their relief was short-lived. One of the men appeared at the end of their row of cars, weapon raised. Don't move, he called out in a voice that suggested he'd used those words before. We just want to talk. Like you talked to Elijah Brooks. Ayana shouted back. That seemed to anger the man. Your father should have minded his own business. Conrad felt rage building in his chest. This monster was talking about murdering an innocent man like it was just another day at the office. You destroyed 17 families, Conrad called out, stepping into view. For what? Money. For business. The man's voice was matter-of-fact. Nothing personal. It's personal to me now. That's when they heard the sirens. Multiple police cars, getting closer fast. The man with the weapon looked confused, speaking rapidly into a radio. Ayana held up her phone, smiling grimly. That video went to more than social media. It went to Agent Torres, with our location tagged. The man cursed and disappeared back into the shadows. Within seconds, they heard vehicles speeding away from the garage entrance. But as Conrad and Ayanna waited for the police to arrive, Conrad's phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. You can't hide behind the FBI forever. We know where you live. We know where she lives. This isn't over. The message included a photo taken from outside Conrad's penthouse apartment just minutes ago. Even with police protection, even with federal agents on the case, they weren't safe. The people behind this operation had resources, connections, and patience. And they weren't giving up. The FBI safe house looked like every suburban home in the neighborhood, which was exactly the point. Conrad sat at the kitchen table, watching Agent Torres spread photographs across the surface. Pictures of suspects' crime scenes and connections that painted a terrifying picture of how deep the conspiracy really went. We've identified the organization behind the construction company, Torres said. The Kozlov family, Russian organized crime, operating on the East Coast for 30 years. Ayanna looked up from her laptop. Russians? I thought this was just local corruption. It started local. But when your restaurants became profitable, they saw an opportunity to expand. Torres pointed to a surveillance photo of a man in an expensive suit. Dmitry Kozlov, the current head of operations. He's been using legitimate businesses as fronts for money laundering since the 1990s. Conrad studied the photo. The man looked ordinary, like any businessman you'd see at a corporate meeting. Have I met him? Probably not directly. He prefers to work through intermediates like Victor Lang. Torres pulled up another photo. But we have surveillance footage of him at the opening of your downtown location 3 years ago. He was there watching his investment. The thought that a crime boss had attended his restaurant opening, maybe even shaken his hand, made Conrad's skin crawl. A knock at the front door made everyone freeze. Torres drew her weapon, motioning for Conrad and Ayanna to move to the back of the house. But the voice that called through the door was familiar. It's Marcus Chun from the Tribune. Ayanna, if you're in there, I want to help. Ayanna's eyes widened. I know him. He's been investigating missing construction workers for years. I sent him information about my father 2 years ago. Torres checked through the window, then holstered her weapon and opened the door. Marcus Chun was exactly what you'd expect from an investigative journalist. Rumpled clothes, tired eyes, and a messenger bag stuffed with documents. I've been trying to reach you both for days, he said, looking directly at Ayanna. After your video went viral, my editor approved a full investigation into the restaurant construction connections. Viral? Conrad asked. Marcus showed them his phone. Ayanna's garage video had been shared over 50,000 times in the past 24 hours. Comments poured in from people sharing their own stories of missing family members, suspicious construction projects, and unexplained disappearances. You've opened a floodgate, Marcus said. People have been afraid to speak up for years. But seeing you two willing to risk everything, it's given them courage. Agent Torres looked uncomfortable. This level of public attention could compromise our investigation. Or it could protect them, Marcus countered. Hard to make someone disappear when the whole world is watching. But Conrad's attention was caught by something else Marcus had mentioned. You said you've been investigating missing construction workers for years. 7 years, actually. Started when a source told me about patterns in city construction projects. Workers who asked too many questions tended to relocate suddenly. Marcus pulled out a thick folder. I have files on 43 suspicious disappearances across 5 states. 43. The number hit Conrad like a physical blow. His empire wasn't just built on 17 graves. It was built on dozens of them. There's something else, Marcus continued. I think I know why they're so desperate to stop you now. He spread out a map showing locations of Conrad's restaurants, marked with red dots, where people had disappeared. But there were also blue dots showing planned construction sites. They're not done. There are 6 more restaurant locations scheduled to break ground in the next 18 months. Based on the pattern, that means... Marcus paused, clearly struggling with the implications. 6 more people will die, Ayanna finished quietly. Conrad looked at the map, at all the red dots representing lives lost to build his success. Then he looked at the blue dots, representing lives that would be lost if he didn't stop this. The choice was clear. But stopping a 30-year criminal organization wouldn't be easy, especially when they had resources, connections, and nothing left to lose. Marcus spread his research across the safe house kitchen table, like pieces of a massive puzzle. It's bigger than just your restaurants, he said to Conrad. The Kozlov organization has been using construction projects as cover for decades. Shopping centers, apartment complexes, office buildings, anywhere they could dig deep foundations. Agent Torres leaned over the documents, her expression growing darker with each page. How did we miss this? Because they were smart about it, Marcus replied. Never more than 1 or 2 disappearances per project, spread across multiple jurisdictions, so no single police department saw the pattern. And they always had legitimate explanations. Worker relocated for another job, left town for family reasons. Ayanna traced her finger along a timeline Marcus had created. My father wasn't the first person to disappear during restaurant construction. Look at this. She pointed to entries from Conrad's second location. 2 city inspectors went missing during the foundation phase. Officials said they'd taken jobs in other states. Conrad felt sick looking at the timeline. Each restaurant opening he'd celebrated represented someone's death. Every ribbon-cutting ceremony, every grand opening party, had been built on a grave. The pattern accelerated after your business started becoming really profitable, Marcus continued. In the early days, they might eliminate 1 person per project. But as your empire grew, so did the stakes. Torres pulled up a file on her laptop. We've been tracking the financial flow through shell companies. The money isn't just being laundered, it's being reinvested in legitimate businesses across the country. Hotels, shopping centers, even a few banks. Ayanna stared at the ground-penetrating radar image, and something deep in her memory began to stir. She'd been trying to remember her father's last few days for 6 years, but trauma had a way of burying details that were too painful to process. Now, looking at evidence of 20 bodies under the construction site, fragments began surfacing like pieces of a broken mirror catching light. I need to see my father's things, she said suddenly. The boxes from his apartment. I kept everything after he disappeared. Agent Torres looked up from her laptop. Ayanna, we don't have time for... No, you don't understand. Ayanna's voice was urgent, filled with a certainty she couldn't explain. He left me something. I know he did, but I was too scared to look for it before. The storage unit was 20 minutes from the safe house, a small concrete box that had held her father's life for 6 years. Ayanna hadn't opened it since the day she'd packed his apartment, too devastated to face his belongings. Now, with FBI protection and Conrad beside her, she rolled up the metal door. The smell hit her first. Her father's cologne mixed with dust and time. His furniture, his clothes, his tools, all waiting patiently for him to come home. But Ayanna went straight to his desk, the same one where he'd helped her with homework every night. She'd packed it carefully, keeping everything exactly as he'd left it. In the bottom drawer, behind files of paid bills and tax returns, her fingers found what she was looking for, a manila envelope marked for Ayanna. If something happens. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were photographs, documents, and a letter in her father's careful handwriting. The photos showed construction workers in various states of distress, some arguing with men in suits, others looking terrified as they pointed at excavation sites. But it was her father's letter that made everything clear. My beautiful daughter, if you're reading this, then my worst fears have come true. The construction project I'm working on isn't what it seems. They're not just building a restaurant. They're covering up something terrible. I found the first body 3 weeks ago, buried in what was supposed to be empty soil. The foreman told me to forget what I saw, that it was probably just old remains from when this was a cemetery decades ago. But I checked the city records. There was never a cemetery here. I kept digging, not in the ground, but in the paperwork. Permits that don't match the actual construction. Money flowing through accounts that shouldn't exist. Workers who ask too many questions suddenly finding better jobs in other cities. But tonight I found something that changes everything. There's a room beneath the old community center, a room that's not on any blueprints. Inside are records going back 20 years. Names, dates, locations. This isn't their first project like this. They're not just money launderers, baby girl. They're killers. And they've been using construction projects to hide bodies for decades. The man in charge isn't who you'd expect. He looks respectable, speaks well, has a family. But I've seen the photographs. I've seen what he's capable of. His name is Dmitry Kozlov, but he has a legitimate business identity too. He owns half the construction companies in the state. He probably owns half the politicians too. I'm going to the FBI tomorrow morning. I have enough evidence to shut down their entire operation. But if something happens to me first, you need to know the truth. The location where they keep the evidence, the real records that could destroy them, is in the basement of 1847 Industrial Boulevard. It's disguised as a cleaning supply warehouse. But in the sub-basement, behind a false wall marked chemical storage, are files that document every murder, every cover-up, every bribed official. I love you more than life itself. If I don't come home, know that I died trying to make sure no other family suffers like ours will. Your father, Elijah Brooks. P.S. The key to the warehouse is taped under the workbench in our garage. I made a copy weeks ago when I was investigating. Ayanna was crying by the time she finished reading. But these weren't tears of grief. These were tears of vindication. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He died trying to protect her and countless others. Conrad read the letter over her shoulder, his face growing pale. 1847 Industrial Boulevard. I know that address. You do. It's 3 blocks from my corporate headquarters. I drive past it every day. Conrad's voice was filled with horror. The evidence of their crimes has been sitting under my nose for 6 years. Agent Torres was already on her phone, coordinating with the FBI field office. We can have a team there in 30 minutes. But as they prepared to leave the storage unit, Ayanna found one more item in her father's desk, a small digital recorder, the kind construction supervisors used for site notes. She pressed play, and her father's voice filled the small space. Day 27 of excavation. Found another body today. That makes 4 total. All show signs of trauma consistent with execution-style murder. Kozlov's people are getting nervous. They know I'm asking questions. If something happens to me, tell my daughter I love her. And tell her that the truth is worth dying for. The recording ended with sounds of footsteps and muffled voices approaching. Those were probably the last words her father ever spoke freely. Subscribe now. You don't want to miss how they finally confront the truth. The warehouse at 1847 Industrial Boulevard looked exactly like what it claimed to be, a rundown building housing cleaning supplies for commercial clients. But as Agent Torres led the FBI tactical team through the front entrance, Conrad and Ayanna following close behind, they discovered that appearances could be deadly deceiving. The main floor was legitimate. Rows of industrial detergent, mop buckets, and commercial cleaning equipment. But hidden behind a false wall marked chemical storage, exactly where Elijah Brooks had described, was a staircase leading down into darkness. The sub-basement was a criminal archive spanning 30 years. File cabinets lined the walls, each drawer labeled with years and locations. Construction projects, missing persons, bribes paid, officials compromised. everything documented with the meticulous care of a legitimate business operation. Conrad opened a drawer marked 2019 to 2020 and found his restaurant construction files, photos of Elijah Brooks, surveillance reports on his activities, and finally, a death certificate dated 3 days after his disappearance. Cause of death listed as industrial accident during excavation. They killed him and then forged official documents to cover it up, Conrad said, his voice thick with rage. But Agent Torres was looking at something else, a newer file labeled Current Operations, Priority Terminations. Inside were detailed profiles of everyone connected to their investigation. Conrad, Ayanna, Marcus Chun, and even Agent Torres herself. They've been planning to kill all of us, Torres said grimly. Tonight. That's when they heard footsteps on the stairs above them. FBI. This is a raid. Exit with your hands visible. The shout came from the main floor, but it wasn't directed at Conrad's group. Someone else was in the building. Torres drew her weapon, motioning for Conrad and Ayanna to take cover behind the file cabinets. Through the radio chatter, they could hear the tactical team encountering resistance on the upper floor. Then Victor Lang appeared at the bottom of the stairs, flanked by 2 armed men. Even in federal custody, he'd somehow orchestrated this final confrontation. I have to admire your persistence, Victor said, his voice carrying the same casual tone he'd used in board meetings. Most people would have taken the hint after the first few threats. You murdered my father, Ayanna said, stepping out from behind the files despite Torres's urgent gestures to stay hidden. Your father was a problem that needed solving, just like you become. Victor nodded to one of his men, who raised his weapon. But Conrad moved faster than anyone expected. He grabbed a heavy file box and hurled it at Victor's gunman, throwing off his aim. The shot went wide, shattering a water pipe and sending a spray across the basement. In the chaos that followed, Torres managed to get off 2 shots, hitting one of Victor's men. But Victor himself disappeared back up the stairs, leaving his wounded accomplice behind. He's running, Torres called into her radio. Subject heading for the main exit. But Conrad knew Victor better than anyone. In 8 years of working together, he'd learned that Victor never entered a room without planning his exit strategy. No, Conrad said, studying the basement layout. He's not running. He's going for the evidence. Conrad was right. The sound of liquid splashing came from the floor above them, followed by the acrid smell of gasoline. Victor's going to burn down the entire building, destroying 30 years of evidence and everyone trapped inside. The basement had only one exit, the stairway Victor now controlled. Torres tried to coordinate with a tactical team upstairs, but radio communication was breaking down as smoke began filtering into the basement. The ventilation system, Ayanna said suddenly. Every basement has emergency ventilation. It has to lead outside. She was thinking like her father, remembering construction details that could save their lives. They found the ventilation access behind another row of files, a narrow metal duct just big enough for a person to crawl through. Ayanna went first, her small size making her the fastest. As Conrad followed her through the cramped metal passage, he could hear the fire spreading above them. Victor's final solution was to eliminate everyone who knew the truth, including himself if necessary. But as they emerged from the ventilation shaft into the alley behind the building, Conrad saw something that changed everything. Marcus Chun was there with a news crew filming the FBI raid in real time. The story was already public. Even if Victor succeeded in burning down the evidence, the truth was already spreading across the internet. Victor's desperate gamble had come too late. Marcus Chen's live broadcast reached 2 million viewers in the first hour. The footage was devastating. FBI agents carrying boxes of evidence from a burning warehouse, while fire crews battled flames that had been intentionally set. In the background, tactical teams led Victor Lang and his remaining accomplices away in handcuffs. But it was Marcus's interview with Ayanna that made the story explode across social media. Standing in the alley behind the warehouse, soot-covered but defiant, she looked directly into the camera and spoke the words that would define the scandal. "My name is Ayanna Brooks. 6 years ago, my father Elijah Brooks was murdered for trying to expose a criminal conspiracy. Tonight, we found the evidence he died trying to protect. 97 people have been killed over the past 15 years, their bodies buried under construction projects across 5 states." She held up one of the files they'd rescued from the basement. "Their names are in here. Their families deserve to know what happened to them." The video went viral within hours. Hashtag Justice for Elijah began trending worldwide. News networks picked up the story, expanding Marcus's initial reporting with their own investigations. Conrad watched the coverage from the FBI field office, still processing the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from lawyers, board members, and investors, all demanding explanations he wasn't ready to give. "The financial markets open in 6 hours," Agent Torres informed him. "Your company's stock is going to take a massive hit when this news fully breaks." "Good," Conrad said, surprising her. "Maybe it should." By dawn, the story had evolved beyond a simple criminal investigation. Social media was flooded with stories from families of missing construction workers, people sharing their own experiences with suspicious disappearances and unexplained deaths. The official response was swift. The Department of Justice announced a federal task force to investigate organized crime infiltration of the construction industry. The FBI opened field offices in 12 states to coordinate with local law enforcement. But the human response was what really mattered. Families who'd spent years wondering about missing relatives finally had answers. Communities that had been terrorized by mysterious disappearances finally understood what they'd been facing. Conrad's corporate headquarters was surrounded by news crews and protesters. Some demanded justice for the victims. Others called for Conrad himself to be held accountable for the crimes committed under his business empire. "They're not wrong," Conrad told Ayanna as they watched the coverage together. "I built my success on other people's graves. I should have known. I should have asked questions." "You couldn't have known," Ayanna replied. "They were professionals. They knew how to hide their crimes. But I chose not to see the people who work for me. I treated employees like numbers on a spreadsheet instead of human beings with lives and families." Conrad's voice was heavy with guilt. "If I'd paid attention to you, to your father, to any of the people who tried to warn me, maybe some of those 97 people would still be alive." The protests outside his building grew larger as the day progressed. But something interesting happened as more details of the story emerged. The crowd began splitting into 2 groups, those demanding Conrad's prosecution and those recognizing him as another victim of the conspiracy. Signs appeared reading Conrad Hale, victim or accomplice, and the truth about the Sapphire Room. By evening, a 3rd group had formed, people supporting Ayanna Brooks, carrying pictures of her father and signs reading "Heroes don't wear suits" and "Elijah Brooks, truth teller." The story had become bigger than just organized crime or corporate corruption. It had become a referendum on who gets heard in America, who gets believed, and who gets ignored. The janitor's daughter had exposed the greatest construction industry scandal in decades. And the world was finally listening. The arrests came in waves over the following weeks. Victor Lang was charged with 17 counts of murder, conspiracy, racketeering, and money laundering. But he was just the beginning. Rodriguez, Conrad's former restaurant manager, accepted a plea deal and testified against 12 other conspirators across 4 states. City officials, construction supervisors, and business executives were led away in handcuffs as the investigation expanded. Dmitry Kozlov, the crime family boss, was arrested at his estate in Connecticut, where FBI agents found additional evidence linking him to construction-related murders dating back to the 1990s. But the most shocking arrest was someone Conrad had never suspected. His own head of security, the man responsible for protecting his restaurants and employees, had been feeding information to the Kozlov organization for 5 years. Every time someone got too close to the truth, he made sure they were silenced, Agent Torres explained during one of their debriefings, including feeding them information about your movements and Ayana's investigation. Conrad's business empire, meanwhile, was in free fall. Stock prices plummeted. Investors fled. 3 major restaurant chains canceled franchise agreements. The Sapphire Room flagship location was closed indefinitely while forensic teams excavated the basement and surrounding property. Bankruptcy is inevitable at this point, Conrad's lawyer informed him. You could protect some assets through restructuring, maybe salvage 10% of your holdings. But Conrad was already making different plans. He'd been meeting secretly with victim families, offering settlements that went far beyond what any court would require. Full financial support for children who'd lost parents. College funds for siblings. Counseling services for families destroyed by the conspiracy. You can't pay for what happened to these people, Ayana warned him during one of these planning sessions. No, I can't. But I can make sure their families don't suffer financially because of what my business became. The media attention was relentless. Conrad's face appeared on magazine covers with headlines like "The Billionaire Who Lost Everything" and "From Riches to Ruins. A Corporate Fall from Grace." But the story that mattered most was written by Marcus Chun for the Tribune. A front-page feature titled "The Janitor's Daughter: How Ayana Brooks Exposed a 30-Year Conspiracy." The article detailed her 6-year investigation, her father's heroic final days, and her decision to risk everything to warn a man who'd barely noticed her existence. Public opinion began shifting. Social media campaigns emerged supporting both Conrad and Ayana. Hashtag Justice for Elijah was joined by hashtag Conrad Did the Right Thing and hashtag Ayana Heroes. Letters poured into newspapers from construction workers, janitors, and service employees sharing their own stories of being invisible to the wealthy people they served. "Your story made me realize that everyone matters," read one letter from a hotel housekeeper in Chicago. "That the people who clean up after others see things that important people miss." 3 months after the warehouse raid, Conrad announced his final business decision. The remaining assets of his restaurant empire would be liquidated. The proceeds would establish the Elijah Brooks Foundation, providing legal aid and investigative resources for families of missing persons in construction-related cases. Ayana would serve as the foundation's director. "Are you sure about this?" she asked him as they signed the paperwork. "I've never been more sure about anything," Conrad replied. "Your father died trying to expose the truth. The least I can do is make sure other families don't have to search for answers alone." Standing outside the courthouse after the signing, surrounded by reporters and cameras, Conrad felt lighter than he had in years. His empire was gone. His wealth was gone. His reputation was forever changed. But for the first time in his life, he'd built something that would actually help people instead of exploiting them. The janitor's daughter had taught the billionaire what really mattered, and the lesson was worth everything he'd lost. 1 year after the warehouse raid, Conrad stood in a room he'd never expected to see again. The former Sapphire Room had been transformed into the headquarters of the Elijah Brooks Foundation, where expensive tables once served wealthy customers. Desks now held case files of missing persons and victim advocacy materials. Ayana walked through the space with the confidence of someone who'd found her true calling. The scared janitor who'd once cleaned these floors at midnight was now the foundation's executive director, leading a team of investigators, social workers, and legal advocates. "The Chicago police just reopened the Rivera construction case," she told Conrad, holding up a thick file. 3 families finally have answers about their missing sons. Conrad nodded, feeling the familiar mix of satisfaction and guilt that came with every breakthrough. Each solved case meant justice for victims, but also confirmation that his former empire had been built on even more graves than they'd originally discovered. "How many active cases are we handling now?" he asked. 47 across 8 states. And the tip line gets about 30 new calls every week. Ayanna set the file on her desk, the same desk where her father's photograph now sat in a place of honor. Construction workers aren't invisible anymore. When someone goes missing, families know they have somewhere to turn. The foundation's impact had grown beyond what either of them had imagined. Ayanna had testified before Congress about worker protection laws. She'd appeared on national news programs advocating for families of the disappeared. She'd become the face of a movement that demanded accountability from corporations that profited from exploiting vulnerable workers. Conrad had found his own role in the transformation. His business experience proved invaluable in tracking financial patterns that indicated organized crime infiltration of construction projects. His connections in the corporate world helped secure funding and political support for legislative changes. But the real work happened in meetings like the one scheduled for this afternoon. The Martinez family sat across from Ayanna's desk, holding hands and fighting back tears. Their son Carlos had disappeared during the construction of a shopping center in Arizona 6 months ago. The police had assumed he'd simply moved on to another job site. "We kept calling the construction company," Mrs. Martinez said in broken English. "They said Carlos never showed up after the weekend. But he wouldn't just leave. He had a baby daughter." Ayanna listened with the patience of someone who'd heard similar stories dozens of times. But her attention never wavered. Her compassion never diminished. Every family deserved to have their story heard completely. "We'll start by requesting all employment records from the construction company," she explained. "Then we'll cross-reference the project timeline with any suspicious financial activities. If there's a pattern similar to other cases, we'll know within a week." Conrad watched Ayanna work and marveled at the transformation. The woman who'd once been afraid to speak up in his presence now commanded the attention of FBI agents, federal prosecutors, and congressional committees. "What made you believe us?" Mr. Martinez asked. "The police didn't. The construction company didn't. Why do you?" Ayanna glanced at her father's photograph. "Because I know what it's like to have everyone tell you that your family member just left. To have people treat a missing father like a personal problem instead of a crime that needs investigating." After the Martinez family left, Conrad and Ayanna stood together in the renovated space, looking at the wall where they'd mounted photographs of all 97 confirmed victims of the construction conspiracy. "Do you ever regret it?" Conrad asked. "Giving up the chance for a normal life to do this work?" Ayanna considered the question seriously. "My father died trying to protect people. Now I get to finish what he started. How could I regret that?" Conrad understood. They'd both lost everything they thought they wanted and found something better in its place. Purpose, justice, the chance to matter. 5 years after the night Ayanna collapsed on the restaurant bench, Conrad stood before a crowd of 300 people gathered for the Elijah Brooks Foundation's annual memorial service. The event was held in the community center that had been built where the Sapphire Room once stood. Instead of serving expensive meals to wealthy customers, this space provided job training, legal aid, and support services to working families in the neighborhood. Conrad looked out at the audience. Construction workers, janitors, security guards, hotel housekeepers, and hundreds of other people whose jobs made them invisible to most of society. But they weren't invisible anymore. 5 years ago, I thought success meant building an empire, he began. I measured my worth in dollars and properties and profit margins. I was wrong. He gestured to the wall behind him, where portraits of all 97 victims were displayed alongside their names and stories. Construction workers, city inspectors, community activists, people who died because they tried to do the right thing. Real success is measured by the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. Real wealth is measured by how many lives you improve, not how much money you accumulate. In the front row, Ayanna sat with Marcusjan, who'd won a Pulitzer Prize for his investigation of the construction industry conspiracy. Beside them sat Agent Torres, now the head of the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force, and dozens of family members whose missing relatives had finally been found and properly buried. The person who taught me this lesson was a janitor named Ayanna Brooks, Conrad continued. She risked her life to warn me about crimes being committed in my own business. She could have stayed silent. She could have looked the other way. Instead, she chose to speak truth to power, even though she had every reason to believe I wouldn't listen. The applause was thunderous, but Ayanna looked uncomfortable with the attention. She'd never gotten used to being called a hero, despite the fact that her courage had led to the prosecution of over 40 criminals and the reopening of hundreds of cold cases. When Conrad finished his speech, Ayanna took the podium. She looked out at the crowd with the confidence she'd developed over years of testifying in courtrooms and speaking at conferences. My father used to tell me that every building starts with a strong foundation, she said. But he also taught me that foundations built on lies will eventually crumble. She pointed to the community center around them. This building sits on the same ground where my father died. But instead of hiding crimes, it's built on truth. Instead of serving only the wealthy, it serves everyone who needs help. Conrad felt tears in his eyes as he listened. The scared woman who'd once mopped his floors had become one of the most powerful advocates for working families in the country. She testified before the Supreme Court, advised presidential candidates on labor policy, and inspired a generation of workers to demand better treatment from their employers. The Elijah Brooks Foundation has helped solve over 200 missing persons cases, Ayanna continued. We've secured millions of dollars in compensation for victim families. We've pushed through legislation that protects construction workers from retaliation when they report safety violations or suspicious activities. But the statistics, impressive as they were, weren't what mattered most to Conrad. What mattered was the 7-year-old girl in the third row, whose father had been found and properly buried after 3 years of searching. What mattered was the construction worker in the back, who'd called their tip line last month to report suspicious activities at his job site, knowing the foundation would protect him from retaliation. What mattered was that Elijah Brooks's death had meaning now. After the ceremony, Conrad and Ayanna walked through the community center together, visiting the job training programs, the legal aid clinic, and the child care center that had been built with funds from Conrad's liquidated empire. "Do you think your father would be proud?" Conrad asked. Ayanna smiled, looking at the families using the services they'd created together. He always said the best way to honor someone's memory is to continue their work. "I think he'd say we're doing okay." Conrad nodded, feeling a contentment he'd never experienced during his billionaire days. He'd lost his empire, his wealth, and his status. But he'd gained something far more valuable. He'd gained the knowledge that his life mattered for the right reasons. If this story inspired you, subscribe to Tales of Action for more emotional and heartwarming journeys.